Okay, so it's the birth of the Middle East as we know it. But before we speak about the First World War, there are a couple of points that I didn't have enough time last week to cover. We were talking, if you remember, about Egypt. And let me bring this here so that I can... we're talking about Egypt. We're talking about the declaration of bankruptcy. We're talking about, if you remember, Khedive Ismail, who's the grandson of Muhammad Ali. You see him here, who's known for many things. He's the builder of modern Cairo. The downtown Cairo, as we know it, is actually named after him, Ismailiyya, named after him. Midan Tahrir used to be called Midan al-Ismailiyya before it was turned Midan Tahrir. And what I wanted to, I mean, there's much to cover with Ismail, but the main theme I wanted to touch upon is how during his reign, as was the case with the Ottoman Empire, we start seeing the growing of a constitutional idea, of the attempts by leading dignitaries in the country, leading merchants, leading officers, leading intellectuals, of the idea of constitutionalism, which is an attempt to subject the ruler of the country to a constitution. This is the same moment we're facing now, exactly the same moment we're facing in Egypt now. We're writing a constitution. Sadly, in my mind, the constitution now is written with the wrong idea in mind. The idea of a constitution is to limit the power of the government, is to make it subject to the will of the people. What the current constitution that is being written now has in mind is something slightly different. We'll come back to this a bit later towards the end of this course. But this is the beginning of the idea of constitutionalism under Ismail.
Wasn't he more focused on economic reforms and that's what caused Egypt to become bankrupt?
Yes, and of course he wasn't very keen on the idea of constitutionalism. He wasn't very keen on his power being curbed and being limited. But it is an idea that is gaining strength, and it is gaining strength, interestingly, within the army. Why? Because the army, if you remember, that was founded by Muhammad Ali, his great-grandfather, or his grandfather, made a big distinction between Turkish-speaking officers and the Arabic-speaking soldiers. And Arabic-speaking soldiers are not allowed to be promoted. So there is a Turkish-speaking aristocracy, in a sense, that is being founded in the country, that is being privileged and at the expense of the majority of the people, the Arabic-speaking masses. And that distinction between the Turkish-speaking, Circassian, privileged class and the Arabic-speaking masses is most manifest in the army. And by the 1870s, by the early 1880s, that idea became physically even present in the character of this guy, Ahmad Arabi. He is an Arabic-speaking officer who stayed in the same rank for something like 20 years without being allowed for promotion. And that represented it was an example of what fellow Egyptians were suffering from under this regime. That all the benefits of the country are going to other people, mostly the Turkish-speaking aristocracy, also backed up, as this painting in a sense shows, backed up by foreign European influence. Businessmen, financiers, bankers, advisors, generals in the army, mostly French and British, backing up the Khedive, that is the title of the ruler of Egypt, representing all of this discrepancy between the mass of the people the majority of Egyptians, the Arabic-speaking Egyptians, and this privileged class. So when this moment happened, eventually called the Arabi Revolution or the Arabi Uprising, one of the amazing slogans that it raised is a slogan that for us now will sound very tautological. Egypt for the Egyptians. Masr al-Masriyin. For us, of course it has to be. Back then, it was actually a truly revolutionary thing to say, because Egypt was not for the Egyptians. Egypt was, that is, the benefits, the revenue, the wealth of Egypt did not accrue to Egyptians. It went to this handful of people, a very privileged Turkish-speaking aristocracy. They're the ones who occupy the senior positions in the government. They're the ones who occupy the senior positions in the army. They're the ones who owned most of the agricultural land, in other words, the wealth. And they are represented by Khedive Ismail and his father and his, the dynasty that Muhammad Ali is represented. And now a lot of foreigners are coming, riding on this bandwagon and using it to make even more money. So Arabi in the army is rebelling against this idea, and he's now heading a movement that surpassed even the army. It became a much wider movement throughout the country, and they are calling for a constitution, they're calling for a parliament, they're calling for a representative assembly, and for an elected government, and indeed they form it. And this is a fabled confrontation. We don't know how much of it is true and how much of it is myth, but supposedly Arabi, at the head of some of his Arabic-speaking officers, go and confront Khedive Tawfiq. If you want to know who he is, we'll go back. It's Ismail's son. He's now the ruler of the country. He's now ruling from this palace. Does anyone recognize it? It's Abdin Palace. It's the seat. It's the official seat of government in Egypt. It's the official palace of the president till today. The president doesn't live there, but that's officially where he's supposed to live. Abdin Palace, newly constructed, only constructed a few years earlier. He goes in that famous piazza in front of Abdin Palace and confronts the Khedive to tell him, you have to abide by our demands. I think all of this is fiction. I don't think he was on horseback. I don't think this confrontation took place. I don't think the actual speech, the fabled speech, we were born free and no one would enslave us. نحن ولدنا أحرارا ولن نستعبد ولا بعد اليوم. Something like this. We were born free. I think this is made up by later historians. It was not actually uttered by him. I mean, there were no audio recordings. There is no Facebook at that time to actually document what was supposedly exchanged. But it was a serious confrontation. Tawfiq panics and sees this as the beginning of the end of his reign, and he calls on the European backers, and the European backers, most importantly Britain, comes to his rescue. And through a long story that I don't have time to go through, the British Army, the British Navy is in Alexandria. It comes to his rescue, uses a certain pretext of an incident that happened in Alexandria to bombard the city, land its troops in Alexandria, marches through the delta onto Cairo, confronts Arabi in the famous battle of Tel Kibir, defeats him, and he's captured. And the Arabi Revolution, this very promising moment of constitutionalism, comes to an abrupt end by European intervention. And in place, the Khedive stays in power, But in fact, now we have a British army of occupation, and the effective ruler of the country is the British ambassador, although he's not called an ambassador, he's called the consul general. This guy is effectively the ruler of Egypt. Why? Because he has an army under his command. This is what colonialism means. They keep the semblance of the Khedive and the ruling dynasty and the privileged class in place, but now there's an army of occupation, and Khedive Tawfiq and all his successors basically do the bidding of this guy. He is the effective ruler of the country. He's the one who effectively appoints the ministers. He's the one who sets the policy. He's the one who effectively and most importantly controls the purse, the budget, money. He's the one who no taxes would be raised except after consulting him. No expenditures will be paid except after consulting him. And this is the guy we met last week. This is one of the most sophisticated minds of high imperialism. Someone consciously building the British Empire, controlling what eventually became a very important part of the empire, of the British Empire, that is Egypt, and he is in complete control of the country. But the resistance continues, the resentment continues among many segments of the population. This is one of the most interesting periods of Egyptian history. This is a very serious blow to Egyptian pride, to Egyptian dignity. You can imagine what it meant, something similar to what the Iraqis found when they tried to get rid of Saddam Hussein, only to find themselves occupied effectively by the Americans. Something very serious. The Egyptians, who had been building their institutions for something like 3/4 of a century, suddenly find the state being usurped, being snatched away from them and put in service of the British Empire. There was a serious feeling of shock, of loss of concentration, loss of direction for maybe 20 years. And this is one of the most interesting periods for me, reading the newspapers and the magazines and the memoirs of these senior Egyptians and not so senior Egyptians, trying to make sense of how come the country ends up being occupied. One of the most perceptive of them is Muhammad Abdu. We have a piece by him, but not the piece we're reading. Another piece by him trying to make sense. How did Egypt end up so easily falling under the control of the British when 100 years later, when the French came under Napoleon, they did not have one night's sleep. The country was a constant state of revolution throughout the 3 years of the French presence in Egypt. And Muhammad Abdu asks this question: what happened in this 8 years? How do we explain the difference between the ferocious resistance that the French faced when they landed under Napoleon in 1798, only to leave 3 years later, and the ease with which the country fell to British control in 1882, and he's writing this in 1902, 20 years later, and they're still here. As we know, they stayed for another 50 years. The British left only in 1954. So it's a 70-odd year period of occupation. And that was a very, very bleak, dark moment in Egypt's modern history. And the beginning of the reversal of this tendency, or this trend, happens in a very bloody incident in 1906. This is an incident that is usually taken to be the beginning of the modern Egyptian nationalist movement, of the beginning of the resistance, of a very serious resistance to the British occupation. This is an incident that is named after the village in which it took place. village in the Delta called Dinshuai, 1906. I'm sure you've come across it, but very briefly, the British army, they're having fun, some soldiers and a couple of officers, they go in the countryside shooting pigeons, game, as they do, hunting and not realizing that in Egypt people raise pigeons. It's property, it's private property. It's not free game. So as a result, there's a skirmish that happens. And as a result of this skirmish, well, different versions then. The British insists that the peasants attacked one of the officers and beat him to death. The Egyptians on their part saying, we didn't beat him, he was tired, we chased after him, and he died out of a sunstroke. Whatever the story is not about this. It's not about how he died. The story was what made this a serious incident is not what actually caused the death of this officer, but the British retaliation, which was very, very severe. Cromer had actually been on vacation in England, but it's the system he put in place. A system whereby an extra-legal tribunal, it's very interesting, an extra-legal tribunal, not the regular legal system that he said that he came to Egypt to bolster and defend and restore law and order in the country. No, an extra-legal tribunal, محكمة استثنائية, was formed, and in no more than 24 hours, it heard the evidence and passed very serious and severe punishments. The death to, I think, 5 peasants, public flogging of a dozen others, and very severe and lengthy prison sentences to yet another number of peasants. Sorry? Flogging, whipping with the whip, publicly. So this was the Egyptian Abu Ghraib. This is the incident that undermined the moral claims of the British occupation. Cromer claimed that he's coming to liberate the Egyptians. He's claiming that he's coming to restore law and order. Yet, in the very first real test of the British presence in Egypt, he reverted back to the very principles that he claimed to eradicate: illegal or extra-legal tribunals, and public flogging and severe punishments. And that was the beginning of a serious, the beginning of a nationalist movement against the British, and something that lasted for another 50 years. So it's a turning point in public consciousness. It's a turning point in the history of the British Empire. It's a turning point definitely in Cromer's career. He was summoned back home the following year for various reasons, but one of them is the fiasco of Dinshuai. The outcry in British Parliament and in the British press against the atrocities, not of how the officer was killed, but of the retaliation by the British/Egyptian authorities against the peasants. So it's a very important incident, both in the history of Egyptian nationalism and the history of British imperialism, and the personal history of Lord Cromer himself. Aslan.
In 1881, Hazarat confronted the
Yes.
And then in 1882, a year later, the British arrived and defeated.
Yes.
What was the British response? And there's a year gap. You didn't just go and say you shouldn't give all the privileges to the Turks, meaning some of it was Egyptians, and then
you have to read the small sections we have in the readings about this. This is a this is a revolution, very similar to what we're witnessing now, in the sense that every single day there's so much happening. I mean, what we're witnessing now is not usual history. What we are literally living through, what happened last week, is something that usually takes a year. What we're witnessing in Egypt now is something that usually takes decades. And we're seeing so many events unfold in such a rapid unfolding that it really is mind-boggling. The same with this period, 1881, 1879, 1882, so much is happening. So there are cabinets being formed, and then they fall, demonstrations and counter-demonstrations. It's a very complex legal, political scene. The Khedive is not standing idle, Tawfiq. He has his own men. He's trying to form a counter-political bloc to confront Arabi with. But ultimately, what tips the balance is the British bombardment of Alexandria. A small anecdote, between parentheses, the history of the British occupation of Egypt in September of 1882 is very significant not only for Egyptian history, but for the theoretical study of imperialism. Whenever you're studying, if you're taking a course in imperial history, unrelated to Egypt whatsoever, the story of how Egypt fell to the British is always offered as a very interesting example of how to explain imperialism, because it's very complex. There are British and French interests. There is the Ottomans in Istanbul. There's local dynasty. Then there is a local anti-colonial movement building up. All of this is fused together that offers a most fascinating example of how the imperial machinery works. Especially if you take in mind the fact that the British government at that time was an anti-imperialist government, if we can call it this. Gladstone's government in London was against the expansion of empire. Yet, it is exactly under Gladstone that the empire expanded. So it's a very interesting case study to look into, to try and explain how imperialism works, and it works in mysterious ways. So it's we don't have time to go into it, but it's a good question, and the answer is a very long one. But to put it simply, Tawfiq is not sitting idle, and ultimately he calls for help for European help. And this is, by the way, this is key for understanding and for the resentment that many people, nationalists and later on Islamists, feel about the liberal, so to speak, westernized elite who are backed by Western powers.
He called for help from the Europeans and the British invaded. Is his fault?
It's not his fault. I mean, the British probably would have invaded anyway. But he sought assistance and gave permission.
And why did they bombard Alexandria? They had the gates are open.
Because Arabi has the army, and Arabi has the batteries in Alexandria, has the forts in Alexandria.
How invested was the British government in Egyptian economy at the time?
Split. There were those who say, like Roma himself, I'm not really defending any vested interest of bankers and financiers and money lenders, and others who saw Egypt as an important link all the way to India and said, especially after the digging of the Suez Canal, we cannot allow any other country to land their troops in this strategic part of the empire. As I told you last week, with the digging of the Suez Canal, Egypt's significance for the British Empire and for Europe becomes very, very, not because of what is happening inside Egypt, as much as what happens in the global sphere in general. and the significance of the Suez Canal for imperial communications. That is, for the line between London and Bombay, between England and its most important colony. As far as economic concerns matter, Egypt is not that significant compared to India. But Egypt as a springboard for Africa, Egypt as a stepping stone to India is very important. Okay, can we move on? And we'll come back to Egypt later on, but we will now leave Egypt aside and speak about how this thing called the Middle East came to be known as the Middle East, and how the many countries that we know in the Middle East came to be formed. So the events I will be recounting in the coming few minutes are events surrounding the First World War, and I want to explain how this map became that map, how the Ottoman Empire, or what remains of the Ottoman Empire, you see Egypt now is all out of the question, out of the equation, how this area, which is the area in white, is what remains of the Ottoman Empire in 1914, came to look like this. This is the modern Middle East. Most of these countries were literally drawn on paper in the period we're going to cover today. So it's a very important period. It's full of drama, and a lot of what we're witnessing today, literally, has to do with events surrounding these years. So, what I want to do is first speak about or identify the main players in the First World War, both in Europe and in the Middle East, and then say something about both the diplomatic and military activities that happened during these formative years and months, and then lastly say something about the significance of all of this to understand the modern Middle East. So let us try and identify first who the main players are. First, we have the Allies, Great Britain, France, and interestingly, joining them, Russia. These are the imperial centers. Russia itself is an empire, and then the British Empire, and France with its imperial possessions. Italy joined later, and the United States joined much later in 1917. So the main European players are Britain, France, and Russia. These are called the Allies, and they are fighting with what are called the Central Powers. The Central Powers are Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We'll see the map in a minute, but the question would be, where is the Ottoman Empire? Which side of the war, of this war, will it join? And it doesn't take a genius to realize that seeing that that Great Britain and Russia, its two main enemies, are now joined together, that it realized, or it decided that it would be a good idea to side with the Central Powers against its traditional historic enemies. And this is exactly what happened. The Ottomans joined the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians against the Allied powers. Now, the interesting thing, I personally, I have to say that between parentheses, I have a very strong personal interest in the history of the First World War for cultural reasons. I like the study of the music and the literature and the ballet and the dance and the poetry of this period. But we don't have time to go through this. Maybe I'll inflict some of my interests on you some other time. But for the time being, I just want to highlight something most amazing about this moment. The summer of 1914. It was literally an idyllic summer. It was a very warm summer in England, and indeed in the continent at large, in England, in Europe at large. And when the war was declared in August, the 1st of August in Europe, hundreds of thousands of people joined to the streets, welcoming the war, thinking that it would be over in a couple of weeks. Little did they know that the war lasted for 4 years, that millions and millions of people died in it, and that it became truly a global war, the first world war. This is a serious moment in the history of humanity, not only the history of Europe. It is when, in a sense, Europe lost its innocence. It's when all the feelings and the ideas about a prosperous future came to a very abrupt and very brutal and bloody end. But these are interesting pictures, actually. These are 4 pictures taken in 4 consecutive days, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of August 1914 in Berlin, Paris, Petrograd, and London. Petrograd, that is Russia, Berlin, and as you can see, millions of people taking to the streets, thinking that the war would be over by maximum Christmas time. And instead, the war reached a stalemate. Here's the map. These are the Central Powers, Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And these are the Allies, Britain and France. Italy would join later. And Russia. So the Russian Empire, this huge empire to the east, allied with France and Britain. And between them is the German and Austro-Hungarian forces. And the question was, which side would the Ottomans join? And as you can see in the colors, they joined that bloc. Yes?
Why were people happy about the war?
Good question. Again, let me postpone this till next time, but to put it briefly, I think there was a moment of enthusiasm by many, even, these are not warmongers, what we saw. Some of them were some of the most sophisticated minds, intellectuals in Europe at that time. But they thought that this would be a war, as it was called, to end all wars. That was its feeling, that this would be one last war that humanity needs to go through to cleanse itself of the hypocrisy, of this stubbornness of the old regimes. So many of the people who embraced the war were, in a sense, revolutionaries who aimed for a better, more just world. And instead, what they had was, as we will see, something very, very bloody. As you can see, the war, these dashed lines are the front, the 2 fronts. Germany found itself fighting on 2 fronts, an eastern front and the western front. And this front is where most of the slaughter happened, in northwestern France, northeastern France, here. This is where literally millions died. This is where in a certain battles, the Battle of Ypres and Somme, in, let's say, 2 days, something like 250,000 people would die. A slaughter the likes of which the world had never seen before. Something extremely, extremely bloody and senseless and useless. And this front did not move except maybe a couple of kilometers either way for 4 years. Who knows the word entrenchment? What does it mean? But linguistically, what does entrenchment mean? What does it mean? Yes, Simon.
Cooperation?
No.
Being burrowed into the ground?
Entrenched is to stand your ground and to reach a stalemate, in a sense. And it is a term that came out of the First World War. Incidentally, many words in the English language were coined in the First World War. Lousy, for example. became a word that spread with the spread of lice among the soldiers because of the very unhygienic conditions in which they lived. This is how they lived, and this is what they fought. This is how they fought for 4 years. This is the trenches. So the two armies would confront each other, no major breakthrough, and instead they would build trenches and fight from these trenches onto each other for 4 years, confronting each other in this way, with the famous no man's land between them, with no major territorial possessions advancement on either side for such a long time. This is a famous, this is the following Christmas. Now, 2 Christmases later, this is how the soldiers lived. No major breakthrough. So it's a stalemate, and any attempt to actually launch an attack, the so-called going on the top, that is crossing over the trenches, would end up with, in 10 minutes, something like 10,000 people killed. So it was in an attempt to break through this stalemate that main strategists in the British Empire and elsewhere are trying to find a way to break through this stalemate. Aslam?
Wasn't Japan in on the war?
Much later.
Which side did they join?
Which side did they join? They joined the Allies. They joined the Allies, but I'm actually not sure. I know the position of Japan in the Second World War, but no, Japan did not join this war.
That was in the Second World War.
No, they had troops as like auxiliary, like in
Yeah,
the back.
but they as an empire didn't.
In one way or the other.
They fought Russia much later on earlier on 1905. That's another campaign.
But before the war, there was a treaty between Japan and the US. So it was expected that if Japan
I actually don't know. I have to check. Frankly, I don't know what the position of Japan was, embarrassingly. I'm not into Japanese poetry, so I don't know much about it. I'll check for you.
Was the source that they received two opposing armies, they met up and then they played a game of football?
Yes.
Then
Yeah, it's a famous football match. It's a famous football match of with this stalemate, the British and yes, on Christmas and New Year's, and they had this football match between the lines in New Man's Land, and this was when news about this reached the headquarters. They decided to end what was called fraternization. You know, people befriending each other. Basically, what the soldiers saw is that they saw each other. They saw themselves in each other. They saw that the people they are fighting are not that different from themselves in terms of their class and their level of education and the kind of ideals they're standing for. And this feeling, of course, was very subversive if it spreads, because basically it's the soldiers rebelling against the officers. It's the soldiers saying, we do not want to go on with this slaughter, and it is our commanding officers who are sending us to our deaths. So let's play football instead. And this is what they did. It's a true story. There was actually a football match in 1914, I think it was, maybe 1915, before Christmas. And the other stories is of Christmas hymns being sung together in different languages across no man's land. And there are many, many movies about and novels about this. And I'll share with you one of them next week. So to break the stalemate, Winston Churchill, who I think was First Lord of the Admiralty at that time in the British Empire, decided, why not open a third front? So if this front is blocked in a sense, this is a stalemate here and a stalemate here, why don't we open a front here against the Ottomans so that the Central Powers are forced to withdraw some troops south, allowing the Russians to have a breakthrough. You see the logic? So this was the idea of Winston Churchill. Let's try and do something here in this area. Attack the Ottomans here. The Ottomans are in alignment with the Hungarians and the Germans. So especially Austro-Hungary will have to divert some of its troops here to defend itself and to defend their allies. And if this happens, maybe the Russians can have a breakthrough onto Berlin. So he amassed hundreds of thousands of troops, interestingly enough, here in Egypt. Troops from Australia, from New Zealand, from Africa. It's the British Empire. And from Egypt, launch a campaign against Gallipoli. Gallipoli is, you see it here. This is where Istanbul is. So it's the southern strait of Gallipoli. So this is the Bosphorus. And this is the Dardanelles. Two straits leading from the Aegean, that is the Mediterranean, to the Sea of Marmara, and from it to the Black Sea. The idea is we land troops here and move on to the capital, Istanbul. And once this happens, Austria-Hungary will come to the assistance of their ally, the Ottomans. The campaign was launched in April of 1915 with disastrous consequences. Look at these figures. This is the beach in which the landing took place. British lost nearly 250,000 men in the few months of the campaign. France lost 47,000 and Turkey 250,000. I mean, these are the figures of the British of the First World War. We're talking not about tens of thousands, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of casualties. The campaign did not go well, as you can see. It was a disastrous campaign for the British Empire. And most of these Commonwealth troops were actually Australian. That's why in Australia, till today, this is a national day of remembrance. The 25th of April is till today in Australia. If you want to watch a movie about this, I told you about this last week. It's one of Mel Gibson's first movies called Gallipoli, named after the campaign, about 25 years old. 25 years ago, this film was made about Gallipoli, and it shows the atrocities of what happened. It's a very narrow beach. The Ottomans are occupying high ground. Whenever the Commonwealth troops establish a foothold here, they're killed with machine guns. The average life expectancy of British troops here was about 15 minutes. That is how disastrous it was. So the campaign failed. Yes.
How successful was it in diverting troops away from Russia?
Not much. Not much because the Ottomans stood their ground. So it seems, this is what I was saying last week, it seems that 100 years of Ottoman military reform paid off. By that time, there is a modern Ottoman army. It stood its ground, it managed to defend the empire, it managed to perform very, very well. And I'm sure you can guess the name of the main general who fought in it.
One of Ibrahim's sons?
No. Ottomans. Yes. That is where he made his name. Mustafa Kemal, he was not yet called Ataturk. That's a title he took later on. But Mustafa Kemal is one of those newly trained military officers, a result of 100 years of military reform. He's in command of one of the main units defending Anzac Beach, defending Gallipoli, and he performed very well with the entire Ottoman army. But as far as we in the Middle East are concerned, that's not the main story. The most important military activities that are connected with the First World War, as far as we in the Middle East are concerned, is not in this area, but in an area much further south. So, not here, but here, in Arabia. And it has to do with a family that called themselves the Hashemites. Now, these are the old Hashemites. Banu Hashim, you can see this is the old 7th century tribe of the Prophet Muhammad, and these are the Hashemites. Now, many centuries later, it's the descendants of these Hashemites who we are concerned with now. And the reason is the following. These Hashemites, Banu Hashim, now are ruling this part of Arabia. If you remember, this is part of the Ottoman Empire. We talked about this extensively. But the Ottomans are dependent on this local family to run these two holy cities. These are, it's a religiously significant family, obviously. They claim descent from the prophets. They call themselves the Hashemites. And from an early time, one of them, Hussein, is being declared the Sharif of Mecca. Now, this is an interesting title. The first thing to clarify, those of you who know English, this is not sheriff. This is not a U.S. Police officer. This is an Arabic title. Sharif is a title for someone who can claim descent of the prophets. Al-Ashraf in Arabic. So this is the Ashraf of Mecca. They are Banu Hashim. And one of them is Hussein. We'll see him extensively in the coming 10 minutes. The Sharif Hussein is declared Sharif of Mecca, which means he is the local Ottoman, the local ruler on behalf of the Ottoman Empire. Some degree of independence, but ultimately paying allegiance to the Ottomans. And this is, you can see his picture here. That's him. And this is the ceremony in which he was declared to be the Sharif of Mecca, which is a new title, by the Ottoman governor here, reading the imperial piece of paper, appointing him as Sharif of Mecca. So this, in a sense, is the servant of the Sultan, of the Ottoman Sultan. And this is 1908, way before the war. Now, there is a major important transformation that happens to this guy. He decides to switch allegiance in the middle of the war. Allegiance. Instead of being the humble servant of the Ottomans, he's now throwing his lot in with the British. Let me explain. Why are the British interested in him? Remember what we said last week about Sultan Abdul Hamid II increasingly casting himself as a Muslim caliph, and how subversive this was for the British, especially with regards to their subjects in India and their subjects in Egypt. And they are concerned about this, and they're looking around and trying to see, is there anyone we can use to counterbalance the religious significance of the caliphate? The stakes are high. It's now the middle of the war. There's a stalemate. The Ottomans are fighting against the British. And the British are looking around and seeing, is there anyone else that we can use and tell those millions of Muslims throughout the empire that they should side with us rather than with the Ottomans.
Wasn't then that they sent the Moran to Raid?
Yes, that's the movie. Wait for 1 minute. So that's the interest of the British in this guy. On his part, he's saying, why the Ottomans? We are Arabs. We are not Ottomans. Now, this is a new idea, and you have to pay attention to it. This is the beginning of nationalism. This is the beginning of Arab nationalism. In a sense, people throughout the empire are increasingly thinking of themselves in different ways and telling themselves, as much as the Ottomans, we are not Ottomans. We are Egyptian, we're Syrian, we're Arab, we're Kurds, we're Greek Orthodox, but not Ottomans. You understand the difference in feeling. And he's saying this to himself and to his followers. And many other people are thinking the same. They're saying the Ottoman Empire doesn't make sense. Ottoman nationality doesn't make sense. There's nothing called Ottoman nationality. What else? Difficult to know, because we don't know what else. Yes?
Was this a result of the COP's Ottoman Hist politics?
Yes, very good point.
Were these
Let me repeat for those of you who haven't heard. Your name? Malak is saying, is this also the result of the CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress in Istanbul, increased Turkish policies? And yes, it is. Many Arabs realize that the ruling government in Istanbul is paying more and more attention to the Turkish side of things rather than the Arab side of things. And there's a lot of resentment against this Turkification policy. And he represents one of them. So he expresses this sentiment, this anti-Turkish, pro-Arab new sentiment. Yes.
But didn't he side with the British because they promised him land after they divided?
Exactly. So I'm trying to say the setup. He is increasingly resentful of the Ottomans. The British are increasingly interested in him, and so they find a common enemy, and they start negotiating. This guy starts conversing with the British, and you have to realize how serious this is. There is a war, and he is an Ottoman subject. In fact, he's been appointed by the Ottomans, and despite this, he opens a secret channel of communication with the British, especially this man. This is the High Commissioner in Egypt, in Cairo, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, and this is Hussein, and they start a dialogue, a series of letters. A series of letters that became known as the Hussein McMahon correspondence. A series of letters that till today, are contested, challenged, and explained. What did they actually mean? But it's basically, what's your name? What Tariq is saying. What did the British exactly promise Hussein? They're telling him, why don't you rebel against the Ottomans? Serious gamble. Serious gamble. And he's pondering it and he says, okay, I'll do this, but what will you do in return? And in return, they're saying, well, we'll give you some areas. Once the war is over, if we end up victorious, actually the British said, when we end up victorious, we'll declare you king of an independent Arab kingdom. In all the areas of the Ottoman Empire in which Arabic is spoken, with the exception of certain areas in Basra, in what became Iraq, and certain areas in northern Syria in Aleppo. Interesting exceptions. Why? Now we know why. Oil, where? Oil was discovered in Basra, here. So the British are aware of the significance of it, and they say, no, 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 you will not have access to this oil. What about Aleppo?
It belongs to the French.
Didn't belong to them, but the British knew that the French had their eye on it. So it's a very interesting, precarious balancing act. And he says, okay, fine. And he decides in sometime in 1916, I can't remember the date, to raise the banner of rebellion against the Ottomans. A very serious gamble. Remember, there's a war taking place, and he decides to switch sides in the middle of the war. And he decides to launch a rebellion in Arabia against the Ottomans. This is what came to be known as the Great Arab Revolt, الثورة العربية الكبرى, and it's the beginning of the modern Arab world.
But were these two areas specifically, northern Syria, specifically such wasn't a problem? The fact that it was very big?
As I said, these letters, there was no map attached to them. There's no map. It's all verbal. These borders were not drawn yet. The meaning of Syria, the meaning of Iraq was not as clear as you might think, as you may think. So you're absolutely right. The problem with these letters is that it's very vague. They're very vague. What was promised, what was denied, became a subject of contestation for years to come.
You also think that the British were trying to avoid the subject, leaving England.
Yeah, the British were evasive. They didn't want to dot the I's and cross the T's. Yes.
Did the Ottomans make any ploy to attack Egypt or the other sort of like British?
Not yet. Not yet. When the rebellion broke out, yes, they did. I'm thinking about time. I'm thinking that this is such a crucial, delicate period, and we only have 7 more minutes. And in these 7 minutes, we have to cover a lot. So I want to ask a serious question. 2 questions. First of all, we have a makeup day on Saturday. You all know this. I sent an email some time ago. Same place, same time. So next Saturday, the 20th, we have a makeup exam. We have a makeup class. Will all of you be able to come on that Saturday? This Saturday, the 20th.
I'm actually going to Alexander with my architecture class. I would get to that.
Okay, but here is what I am proposing. I'm proposing to postpone the exam from Thursday to Saturday. Saturday. We're supposed to have the exam on Thursday. To postpone it from the 18th to the 20th. Why? Because this is a very delicate period. I want you all to get it straight as it could be. It's confusing. So I don't want to rush in the coming 7 minutes. So can we have the continuation of today's lecture on Thursday? And then we will all, you'll have to make it here anyway on Saturday, because as you got the note from the provost's office, this is the first of the makeups for the lost days. So we'll have the exam on Saturday rather than Thursday. Okay, so we'll do this. We'll continue. If anyone cannot make it, we will have to make special personal arrangements. But I don't want this to mean that I mean, I'll have to discuss it individually. If you have a valid, legitimate reason for not being here, because another class, let's say, is taking you out of the city, then that's fine. We can make time. But I haven't finished yet. I have 2 more minutes. But I want to receive questions, because I know there's a lot that we have covered already. So you have questions so far about the story and how it is unfolding. Yes.
I'm a bit confused about the situation in Egypt during the war, as both a member of the Ottoman Empire and
The question is about Egypt. From the time of Muhammad Ali, Egypt is governed by a different set of rules. So all of this arrangement by the First World War, Egypt is outside all of this. The position of Egypt, given what we said at the beginning of today, is very confusing and ambiguous. Here is the situation. We have a local dynasty. If we go all the way back, we have a local dynasty ruling the country. So it's a ruling family, so to speak. Then we have Ottoman control. Technically, Egypt is still part of the Ottoman Empire. And to make it even more confusing, we have the British Army of Occupation. So what do you think? What do you think the legal status is of Egypt in, let's say, the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, in international law?
They have no say in anything.
No, this is practical, legal.
It's British. What are they calling it?
A British what?
Colony.
A British protectorate. It's not a colony. Egypt was never a colony, an official colony. An official colony would be what? Would be a part of the empire that is ruled from London. So London sends, like in India, a viceroy, a ruler, who takes his commands from London. That's not the case in Egypt. Egypt, this guy is not the viceroy. He's a consul general, ostensibly an ambassador. Ostensibly an ambassador of a foreign country in an independent state. But of course, Egypt is not independent. So it is part of the Ottoman Empire. There is an Ottoman, of course, there's an Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul, but there is an Ottoman representative in Egypt who's supposedly sovereign. There is a head of state. These guys, these are the rulers of the country in succession. So there's a ruling family, and there is a British Army of Occupation. So technically, Egypt is, it's not international. I mean, it's contested over. Yes, there is an international contestation. Eventually, the British end up landing in Alexandria. The Suez Canal is of paramount importance. That's the most important interests of the British. And the troops are mainly defending the canal. And it was called the Veiled Protectorate. It's not even an official protectorate. It became an official protectorate with the outbreak of the First World War. Finally, the British said, enough of this ambiguity. The Ottomans are out. You are now a protectorate of Britain. You are very important for us. We will protect you. And you are, in a sense, subservient to us. But, again, not a colony. It's not a colony.
Is the Ottomans had control of Egypt? Egypt was a part of the Ottoman Empire. When the British came, why didn't the British and the Ottomans fight over it? And when whoever wins is weak, Egypt just comes and gets rid of it all?
Because the British are too clever. British realize that if they actually explicitly fight the Ottomans, the French and the Germans and the Italians and the many other contesters will fight against Britain. And in a sense, you can think of the First World War as that. The delayed, they're too weak. Militarily, they're too weak. They don't have enough manpower to snatch Egypt back from the Ottomans, from the British. So I'm running out of time, so we'll continue with these stories, with these questions and more on Thursday. So again, the exam is not Thursday, the exam is on Saturday. And please look at the questions. If you have any questions about the questions, let me know on Thursday.